It was the kind of morning where nothing stood out. The sun hadn't yet reached its peak. And the world was still gently waking up. I sat in my kitchen, sipping my coffee like I did every morning. Quiet. Peaceful. Life in the suburbs was a rhythm. A calm beat that I'd long gotten used to. I had my routine: go to work, take care of my lawn, check the mail, then retreat into the comfort of my own space. I'd always preferred to keep to myself. Maybe it was because I was no longer looking for anything more. No family of my own. No need for anything to change. I had a few neighbors, but none of them were particularly close. A nod. A smile. The occasional wave. I didn't mind it. It was enough. Then, one afternoon, a moving truck pulled up next door. It was an old truck. The kind that had seen better days. They unloaded boxes, bags, and furniture. But it wasn't until I noticed the woman and her son that I realized this wasn't just any other move. She was young. In her early 30s at most. With dark, tired eyes. And the boy, he couldn't have been more than 10. He was small for his age. And he kept his head down, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't know it then. But this was the moment my life would begin to change. I first saw them a few days after the truck left. When the woman, her name, I would later learn, was Claire, was outside trying to wrangle a garden hose that had somehow gotten itself tangled in knots. The boy, whose name was Ben, was sitting on the front steps, kicking a rock around. He didn't seem interested in helping. I remember feeling a sense of discomfort watching Claire struggle. She wasn't exactly struggling in a way that made me think she was helpless. But there was something about the way she moved, the way her shoulders hunched, that made me wonder if she was holding herself together just barely. She had that look, the one that said life was taking more out of her than she could afford to give. I debated whether to go over and offer a hand. Normally, I wouldn't have given it much thought. But for some reason, that morning, I felt a pull to do something. Even if it was just saying hello. I watched her tugging at the hose, looking frustrated. When I finally made up my mind, I left my porch and stepped across the yard. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel. "Need a hand with that?" I called out. She looked up, startled at first. I must have caught her off guard. But then her face softened into a tired smile. "Oh? Thank you. But I think I've got it." There was something about the way she said it, polite but distant, that made me feel like I was intruding. But I stayed where I was, unsure what to do next. Ben didn't even look up at me. He was too busy with his rock. I couldn't help but notice that he didn't speak much. Didn't seem to care for the world around him. He was more of a shadow than a person, always a few steps behind the real action. Like he was still trying to figure out where he belonged. I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to break the silence. "I'm across the street," I said, pointing vaguely. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Claire's eyes softened then. She nodded slowly. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks." There was a tension in the air between us. I could tell she wasn't used to accepting help. And Ben, well, he didn't even seem to register that I was standing there. I could tell that the mother and son weren't exactly in sync. She was a woman trying to navigate life alone. And he was, well, I wasn't sure what was going on with him. I waved as I walked back across the yard, feeling a little awkward. As I retreated into the solitude of my house, I thought about Claire and Ben. I wasn't one to get involved in other people's business. but something about them felt unfinished. A week later, I found myself outside when I saw Ben playing in the yard. He was on the edge of the driveway, tossing a baseball against the garage door. I'd been in the middle of trimming my hedge when I noticed him struggling with the catch, missing the ball, and letting it roll into the street. I wasn't one to make a fuss over small things, but I felt a tug inside me, a recognition of something I didn't know how to put into words. I wiped my hands on my pants and walked over. "Hey, Ben," I said casually. "You're gonna need to be quicker than that if you want to catch it." He didn't seem startled by my voice, but he did look up, meeting my eyes for the first time. His face was expressionless, but there was something in his gaze, something tired, a little empty. He gave a half shrug, then jogged to fetch the ball. I stood there for a moment, watching him. When he returned, I felt an odd compulsion to say something more. "Your mom around?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the silence between us that made me want to fill the space with words. Ben shook his head, holding the ball in his hands now. "She's inside." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. But before I could turn away, Ben spoke again. "Do you play baseball?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. It was such a small question, but it made me pause. I wasn't the athletic type anymore. My days of playing baseball were long gone. But I liked the idea of showing him something, teaching him something, even if it was small. "I used to," I said, smiling a little. "You want me to show you how to throw a proper curveball?" Ben blinked at me, and for the first time, a small spark of interest crossed his face. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice barely audible. We spent the next hour throwing the ball back and forth. I didn't notice how much time had passed until the sun started sinking lower in the sky. Ben had a quiet way about him. But when we played, I saw a glimpse of something else, a boy who just needed someone to pay attention. Someone to teach him something that wasn't just schoolwork or chores. He was eager to learn, even if he didn't show it all the time. As I tossed him the ball for the last time that evening, I realized something. I'd helped him, sure, but it felt like something bigger was at play. Ben didn't need just a neighbor. He needed a role model, a father figure. I wasn't sure I was ready for that, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that had started to settle in my chest. Over the next few weeks, I found myself slowly becoming more involved in Ben and Claire's lives. At first, it was small things: fixing a leaky faucet, mowing the lawn when Claire didn't have the time, or offering advice on things I knew a little about. It wasn't anything monumental, but it seemed to help her. Claire never asked for help, but I could tell she was grateful when I gave it. There were moments when she would catch my eye, and for a brief second, I could see the weight she carried. But she never spoke about it. Instead, she focused on Ben, trying to keep everything together while he seemed to drift further and further away from her. One day, I noticed Ben sitting alone in his room, staring out of his window. I couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Was he just bored? Or was there something deeper, there something I couldn't understand just by looking at him? The truth was, I didn't know how to help. But one thing I did know was that I could keep showing up. That was the one thing I could do. And maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. I continued to help, even when it was inconvenient. And slowly, the bond between Ben and me started to solidify. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always comfortable. But one evening, as we were tossing the baseball again, Ben looked at me and asked, "Do you think I could ever be as good as you?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't just about baseball. It was about something else, about Ben seeing me as someone to look up to. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about fixing things or throwing a ball. It was about filling a void he didn't even know he had. I wasn't prepared for how much I'd end up caring for them. It started small: more time spent with Ben. More evenings spent at Claire's house when she had to work late. But as time went on, I found myself feeling more responsible for their well-being than I ever expected. The tipping point came when Claire had to leave town for a few days due to a family emergency. She left Ben with me, asking me to look after him in her absence. She was hesitant, unsure if I could handle it. But there was a desperation in her eyes that made me agree without hesitation. Those few days were more intense than I had anticipated. Ben didn't open up much about his feelings, but I saw the way he struggled with his emotions. He was scared, uncertain, and not at all sure what to do with his life. It was during those days that I realized how much he relied on me, how much he needed someone who wasn't just a neighbor, but a steady presence. And as much as I told myself I wasn't looking for this kind of responsibility, I knew I couldn't walk away from it. I had already stepped in, and I was in this for the long haul. I wasn't sure when exactly it happened, but somewhere in the weeks that followed, I began to feel a deep shift. It was subtle at first, like a quiet tide rising. And then suddenly, it was crashing over me. I had become more than just a neighbor or a casual helper. I was a presence in their lives, a constant, unshakable one. The first real test came when Ben faced a major crisis. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just the usual routine of school pressures and growing up, but one afternoon, he came home from school with a black eye. At first, he wouldn't tell me what had happened. He stood there, silent, avoiding my gaze. I could tell it wasn't just a random accident. Ben wasn't the type to get into fights. But this was different. Something had happened that made him feel small, humiliated even. I sat him down, careful not to overwhelm him with questions, but urging him gently to open up. "I got into a fight with some of the other kids at school," he said quietly, his eyes downcast. I waited, letting the silence fill the room. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "They keep calling me names, saying stuff about my mom and me." I could feel a lump in my throat, my heart aching for him. It wasn't just kids being cruel, it was something deeper, a reflection of the life he was living. I knew it wasn't just about the words. It was about his place in the world. The confusion, the loneliness that came with not having a father to stand up for him. In that moment, I didn't know what to say, but I knew what I had to do. I stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Ben. You don't have to handle it by yourself. I'm here." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to understand whether I really meant it. "I won't let anyone hurt you," I said firmly, my voice steady. And I meant it. That night, after Ben had gone to bed, I stayed up late, thinking about everything. The weight of the responsibility felt heavier now. But strangely, I also felt more determined. I wasn't just offering help anymore, I was offering protection. I had become the father figure that Ben needed, whether I was ready for it or not. The next day, I marched down to the school and had a long conversation with the principal about the bullying. I made it clear that I wasn't going to let this slide. I don't know what made me so resolute. Maybe it was the thought of Ben going through life without someone to fight for him, but I wasn't backing down. I don't think Claire ever fully knew what happened. And I wasn't sure if I should tell her. But I couldn't just stay on the sidelines anymore. After that, Ben seemed a little different. He was quieter. Yes. But he was also more confident in his own way. The black eye healed. But the change inside him was something that couldn't be seen on the outside. He started to hold his head a little higher, speak a little louder, and walk a little taller. But there were still moments of vulnerability, times when he would stare off into the distance. Or when I would catch him looking at me like he was trying to figure out where he fit in all of this. I didn't have the answers. But I could be there. That was the one thing I could offer. Things took a turn one night when Claire called me in the middle of the evening. Her voice was shaky. Panicked even. "I need you to come over," she said. Her words rushed. I've been laid off. I don't know what to do." I could hear the weight of it in her voice. I'd seen Claire struggle in small ways before. But this was something else. Her job had been her only source of stability. Without it, everything was uncertain again. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and went over immediately, finding her in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she might fall apart if she let go. She didn't need me to tell her everything would be fine. She knew it wasn't. Instead, I just stood there, listening. She broke down. Not in the way I expected, but with quiet sobs that shook her entire body. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said through her tears. "How am I supposed to keep this together? I can't even take care of Ben right now." I could see the panic in her eyes. The fear that she wasn't enough. She was a mother, trying to juggle everything on her own. And now it felt like the world was crumbling down around her. I moved to her side and put a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Claire. You've got Ben. And you've got me." She looked up at me, searching my face as if trying to gauge whether I meant it. It wasn't some grand gesture. But in that moment, I knew it was what she needed to hear. "I've got Ben," she repeated softly, as if reminding herself. The crisis didn't vanish overnight. Claire didn't suddenly find a new job or solve all her problems with a single conversation. But in the weeks that followed, I saw something change in her. She stopped trying to carry it all alone. Slowly, she began to lean on me more, not just for help around the house, but emotionally, too. She'd sit with me sometimes, talking about her day, her fears, and her dreams. There was a vulnerability there that hadn't existed before. And I realized that maybe I'd become more than just a neighbor to her. We weren't exactly becoming a family in the traditional sense. But something was shifting. There were moments when she would catch me looking at her, and she would smile, a small, quiet smile, as if acknowledging the bond that had formed without us even realizing it. One night, after we had sat down for a simple dinner together, Ben looked up at me with that same questioning look. He seemed to be waiting for something, an answer, a confirmation. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" he asked quietly, almost uncertain of the words leaving his mouth. I looked at him, not sure what the right answer was. But then I realized that there was only one answer I could give. "No, Ben. I'm not going anywhere." And it wasn't just for him anymore. It was for Claire, too. I had never planned on being involved in anyone's life like this. But here I was. And I couldn't imagine walking away. Months passed. And life settled into a new routine. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was better than it had been. Ben's confidence grew. Claire found a new job. And though it wasn't what she'd expected, it was a start. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And I could see the change in her. There were still challenges. Of course. Money was tight. Ben still had moments of struggle at school. Claire would sometimes slip back into that dark place of worry, questioning herself. But through it all, I was there. And Ben. He had started to call me Mr. John, as if the title had finally felt right to him. It wasn't the same as calling me Dad, but I could see that he understood the role I had come to play in his life. We weren't a typical family. But we were something more than strangers. We were a unit. A team. We had found our way to each other. And that was enough. A year later, I stood outside in the yard, watching Ben and Claire. Ben had grown taller, more mature. He was running around with friends from the neighborhood. A smile on his face. A laugh in his voice. I felt a sense of pride. Though I hadn't raised him the way I'd once thought a father might. Claire was sitting on the porch, reading a book. She looked up at me and smiled. And for a moment, I couldn't help but think back to how far we'd come. From that first awkward conversation about a hose, to this moment of quiet contentment. I knew that life had a way of giving you what you didn't expect. And sometimes, the family you find is the one you never planned on. I wasn't the man I'd been before. None of us were. But in this small, unexpected family of ours, I had found something real, something that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. And as I stood there, watching Ben run back toward the house, I realized that I didn't just step into a father's role for the boy. I'd done it for myself, too. We had become a family not by blood, but by choice. And that, I thought, was the most important thing.